Welcome to Workplace Positive Psychology Exercises, an evidence-based guide to implementation. This webinar is part of our ongoing Psychology in the Workplace series. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Yusra Benjeloun, Administrative Coordinator and Project Manager with the Work Wellness and Disability Prevention Institute, and I'll be co-moderating the webinar today. This webinar is made possible through the support of the Community Gaming Grant Program through the BC government, as well as donations and memberships to WWDPI. We thank our program partners, Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, Education Advisory Committee, and speakers who contribute to this webinar series. While we're waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing and to ask any questions you have related to the presentation. We will collect questions submitted throughout the presentation and follow the presentation with a Q&A based on the questions submitted. Following the webinar, any questions not answered in the allotted time will be answered and distributed after the event. The presentation will be recorded and posted for free on our website along with the slides. You will be emailed the direct links for all of these items when they're available. Today's webinar will be co-moderated by Dr. Gloria Gonzalez Morales, Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology at University of Guelph and Research Director in Occupational Health and Positive Psychology Lab. Gloria will be moderating our Q&A session, and I will let her introduce herself and Dr. Caroline Winslow, who will be our presenter.
Thank you, Yusra. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Caroline Winslow. Dr. Winslow is an industrial and organizational psychologist, applied researcher, and consultant at the Interdisciplinary Center for Healthy Workplaces at the University of California, Berkeley, whose mission is to integrate and apply interdisciplinary sciences to achieve worker well-being. Therefore, her program of research at the center focuses on understanding and improving employee psychological well-being with a focus on identifying ways of promoting positive emotional experiences at work and their subsequent effects on valued organizational outcomes. She has experience designing positive psychology programs and interventions for implementation in a variety of organizational settings, and she's passionate about using science to inform evidence-based organizational policies and practices that contribute to the health, happiness, and performance of employees. Beyond employee well-being, she has also conducted research on a variety of other organizational psychology topics relevant to well-being, including workforce diversity and inclusion, effective organizational leadership, and team performance processes. Her research has been published in top psychology journals, including the Journal of Occupational Health Psychology, the Journal of Business and Psychology, and the Annual Review of Organizational Psychology and Organizational Behavior. She currently serves on the Healthy Work Design and Wellbeing Cross-Sector Council as part of the National Occupational Research Agenda, and she received her PhD in Industrial and Organizational Psychology from George Mason University in 2017. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about Dr. Winslow, it's her turn to talk about the evidence-based guide to implementing workplace positive psychology exercises.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez Morales and Yusra, for the introduction. I really am honored to have been invited to give this webinar, which will be, as Dr. Gonzalez Morales said, a guide to implementing workplace positive psychology exercises in practice. So these exercises arguably are relatively simple practices that can be incorporated into daily life, and research suggests that they have the potential to benefit the well-being of individual employees as well as the organizations of which they are a part. I do believe the implementation of these practices is not only a science, but also an art. And to that end, I'm excited to be sharing what I've learned from both my research and practical experiences. I really hope that you enjoyed today's webinar and learned something new. Okay, so let's get started and take a look at today's agenda more specifically. So first, I'll provide some background to explain how positive organizational psychology is defined, the outcomes that these are intended to impact, and briefly, how individual and organizational level practices can be distinguished from one another. Next, I will review a variety of practices that have been adapted for use in the workplace. And I want to be clear from the get-go and explain that although individual level and organizational level practices have been studied, the focus of this webinar will be on individual level practices. Third, I'll take some time to briefly discuss factors that may influence the effectiveness of these practices, which are important because they relate to the final agenda item, which is guidance for implementing these practices in an actual organization. And then finally, after I speak for about 45 minutes on these topics, I'll be happy to take questions during the final Q&A portion of the webinar. So let's take a step back for a moment and define positive organizational psychology, also known as POP. POP can be defined as the scientific study of positive subjective experiences and traits in the workplace and positive organizations, and its application to improve the effectiveness and quality of life in organizations. So I've bolded a few key terms here to show how this is a science that's focused on cultivating positive experiences or states of well-being, as well as more stable traits or individual differences. So in addition, POP attempts to translate research and theoretical principles into practice to improve not only well-being, but also to improve effectiveness or performance as a downstream effect of well-being. Having difficulty moving my slide forward. There we go. It's also important to note that positive psychology focuses on increasing positive experiences and traits, as opposed to solely mitigating or reducing negative ones. So in the context of the workplace and organization specifically, this means seeking to improve or cultivate the following well-being related outcomes. So positive emotions like gratitude and joy, a sense of optimism about the future, resilience after setbacks, work engagement, or the extent to which employees are attentive to and motivated to complete their work. Workplace positive psychology practices have also been studied in relation to their ability to foster workplace social connectedness, job satisfaction more generally, work-related self-efficacy, which is people's belief in their ability to do their job, and also so-called organizational citizenship behaviors, which are voluntary positive behaviors that employees engage in even though they're not formally required to as a part of their job description. So in other words, your willingness to go above and beyond at work in a way that benefits the organization. So keep in mind that this is just a sample of work-related outcomes. There are many others, but I hope that this will give you a sense of the sort of work-related well-being outcomes that these practices are intended to impact. So as I mentioned today, I'll focus on the individual level practices, but it's important to keep in mind that both individual level and organizational level practices are important for cultivating positive organizations. I really want to emphasize that we need both, and that individual level practices are not a substitute for organizational level ones. So what exactly is meant by organizational level practices? So to give you a sense briefly, these organization level approaches seek to improve the well-being of employees by enhancing positive characteristics of the job and also the physical and social working environment. So for example, an organization-focused practice may seek to change characteristics of the worker's task, the working conditions, and or the social relationships or interactions at work. Regarding task changes, these typically focus on things like improving simple and repetitive jobs, adding elements that increase responsibility, and otherwise enriching the job itself. Changes in working conditions are changes to things like workload, working time, as well as environmental issues like noise, temperature, and ergonomic improvements. And then finally, efforts to improve social relationships focus on improving access to social support, conflict management, and also things like communication. And often with this approach, the social approach, supervisors are trained in how to provide more effective feedback, carry out performance appraisals, and resolve conflicts among employees. So as you can probably tell, these organizational practices are hugely important for impacting well-being. These organizational level practices can be contrasted with individual level approaches that directly target the individual and their feelings, behaviors, and cognitions, also known as thoughts, rather than their job or the environment in which they operate. That said, you'll see that the practice of job crafting that I'll cover in a bit is sort of an exception because it can also focus on the job itself. And even though the organization may offer employees things like time to complete activities and permission from management, they typically are employee initiated and directed. The one advantage of these practices is that they entail activities that individuals can pursue and complete themselves without much support from either another individual, like a coach or a program facilitator, or from management. These individual level activities are also defined by their relative discreteness, meaning that they can be planned and have a recognizable beginning and end. But, at the same time, they're practices, right? So the hope is that these feelings, behaviors, and thoughts will, over time, become more routine. So, for example, I'll talk about practicing gratitude, which, if you practice enough, could change from a planned, one-off activity to a habitual way of thinking. So over the past decade or so, many individual level positive psychology exercises have been adapted to or explicitly developed for use in the workplace. The ones that I'll describe today are gratitude, kind acts, job crafting, and personal strength. First, though, I do want to provide a quick caveat. So I'll review a number of practices in today's webinar that have been studied, but I do want to emphasize that the science on what works, to what extent, for whom, and in which conditions and context is still very much evolving. There was another webinar in this series given by Dr. Seth Kaplan, which spoke to the state of the science. And I'd highly recommend checking that out if you haven't already for some additional information that may provide further guidance on when and how to implement these practices in your organization and your life. Okay, so the first practice I'll review is gratitude. Gratitude is acknowledgement that good fortune is attributable to someone or something else. And it's been consistently shown to relate to increased well-being. The importance of gratitude has been recognized for centuries, and it's a core component of many religions. Parents teach their children to express gratitude at a very young age, and multiple nations even have whole holidays devoted to the expression of gratitude. I think this is a testament to the value of gratitude in today's society. Researchers distinguish between so-called benefit-triggered gratitude and general gratitude. Benefit-triggered gratitude is felt in response to a specific action by another person. So, for example, someone who may be grateful that their parents paid for their college education. More general gratitude, which is a broader appreciation or thankfulness for what is important and meaningful in one's life, may be gratitude for general things like family or for health. So the link between gratitude and well-being is strong, and several different forms of gratitude interventions have been developed and evaluated by researchers. These forms include creating gratitude lists or journals, engaging in grateful contemplation, and also directly expressing gratitude through writing and verbally in a so-called gratitude visit. The first of these, gratitude lists and journals, is seen as the classic gratitude activity that has received the most research attention. The gratitude listing or journaling means making a gratitude list of the things that you're grateful for, usually at night before bed each day. And sometimes it helps to pick a specific number of things per the research. So for example, recording 3 things nightly. And research also suggests that it's important to be specific about what you're grateful for and think about how you felt when that something good happened to you. So fun fact, for years I've been keeping a regular gratitude e-journal that I simply email to myself nightly after reflecting on the past day's events. And then there also is grateful contemplation. So this practice is less specific than listing things or occurrences and involves thinking about or writing about the things that you're grateful for in a more global fashion. Some people choose to contemplate through meditation or through prayer. Whichever way you choose to do is up to you. And then finally, there are direct behavioral expressions of gratitude. With this form of the exercise, people identify someone they're grateful to or for, and either visit them or thank them in person, or write them a letter for the explicit and sole purpose of thanking them. It can really be a neat exercise. All three forms have been shown to be effective for enhancing well-being and can be easily adapted for use in the workplace and among employees. So, for example, you can keep a list of work-related things that you're grateful for. You can engage in grateful contemplation at work or about work. And you can also pay a gratitude visit to a coworker or client or anyone else that you work with. And it may sound trite, but at its core, gratitude helps people refocus on what they have instead of what they lack, which is a natural human tendency driven by psychologists. And it may feel contrived at first, but the research suggests that gratitude is a mental state that grows stronger with use and practice. So next I'll review kindness, which in a way is the flip side of gratitude because we're grateful for those who are kind to us. Kindness has a rather simple definition that I'm sure you picked up in kindergarten, and that is actions intended to benefit others. So there's an entire body of social science research devoted to understanding kindness and related behaviors, which in more academic-y terms has been referred to as altruism, pro-social behavior, and so-called positive deviance. So typically in our society, doing something kind for another person is seen as benefiting others at a cost to yourself. And that may be true to some extent, but research suggests that such kind acts can actually improve the well-being of the person performing that act. And it really doesn't need to be some grand act to achieve those well-being benefits. So what does kindness look like according to researchers? Kindness takes on several forms, just like gratitude, but I'll stick to those that are most relevant to the workplace. So first, kindness can be sympathy and compassion to those in need. This is an emotional type of kindness. So for example, at work, you might take the time to actively listen to a coworker who just had a conflict with their supervisor instead of brushing them off or just focusing on your own work. Kindness can also be a caring behavior or a giving act. So for example, choosing to stay late to help a coworker who's having difficulty meeting a deadline. It can also be something as simple as starting or ending a meeting on time. Finally, kindness has been defined as choosing to cooperate with another person or team, even though it might be easier to resist or stand your ground. And in particular, I think being the first person to cooperate or relent when the opposing party seems unwilling is indeed a form of kindness per the research definition, and one that I think certainly could be exercised more in today's competitive workplaces. So of all of these positive psychology practices, kindness admittedly is the least studied in the context of the workplace to my knowledge, and it's mostly been studied in other more general contexts. But I would suggest, given how transactional work is, it's a place where there's a lot of opportunity to exercise kindness. And if you're looking for ideas on how to carry this out at work, really a simple online search for kindness at work will yield a lot of examples of things that you can do. It's a great brainstorming activity. And to that end, I included a link to my search results. And if you click on that link, you'll see that these really don't need to be over-the-top gestures. Little things can really go a long way in enhancing the well-being of others, yourself, and in creating a kinder workplace culture more generally. And one last point about kindness, you may think to yourself, well, I'm already a kind person. But here, the point really is to intentionally engage in kindness above and beyond what you may already do, to make an effort to be more kind than you usually are. This is where the research suggests that well-being benefits are reaped. Next, let's turn to job crafting, which admittedly is my personal favorite type of positive workplace activity because it really helps give more control to the employee. So let me explain. So job crafting is the process of employees redefining and reimagining their job designs in personally meaningful ways. The goal here is to engage in exercises that help you turn the job you have into the job you want. So by nature, job crafting challenges the notion that we all have that job responsibilities are fixed. It's creative, improvised process, and the end goal, as per the definition, is to create more meaningful work, which here means the amount or degree of significance employees believe their work to possess. So it's really about creating meaning. So job crafting is when employees proactively revise their work roles, but how can they do this? So I'm sure this sounds a little bit abstract at the moment, so I'm going to attempt to break it down a bit. Researchers suggest that job crafting can take on 3 different forms: task crafting, relational crafting, and cognitive crafting. So task crafting is changing the number, scope, and type of job tasks, altering the set of responsibilities prescribed by a formal job description by adding or dropping tasks, altering the nature of the task, or changing how much time, energy, and attention are allocated to certain tasks. So for example, you may have a customer service representative who is tech savvy and enjoys helping other non-tech savvy reps with their tech issues, as opposed to referring them to an outside IT team. And this person is actively choosing to do something that's not part of their formal job description, but which brings personal meaning. In this case, exercising those coveted skills. Relational crafting means changing the quality and or the amount of interaction with others encountered on the job. So for example, I like to think of hairstylists who feel isolated or lonely on the job, or who may feel isolated or lonely on the job, and who seek to create more desirable and pleasant interactions by asking clients personal questions and by deliberately making personal disclosures about themselves in an attempt to enhance closeness. On the flip side, relational crafting can also mean exercising discretion or setting boundaries in your social environment. So, for example, you may alter your work schedule to avoid unnecessary interactions with coworkers that maybe you don't have a pleasant interactions with, and not necessarily a strong reason to interact for work-related reasons. And then lastly, there's cognitive job crafting. So this one is a little bit different. It's really about altering how the tasks and relationships that make up the job are perceived. So in this sense, it's more of a mental exercise rather than a behavior. So for example, a hospital custodial staff member who views their work as a vital part of the patient care team rather than just a cleaner. And likewise, a movie ticket salesperson who views their job as an essential part of providing people with entertainment, not just someone who's processing tickets. It sounds trite, I know, but cognitive crafting is about changing your attitude towards your job, even when it might frankly stink. So importantly, as with these other activities, job crafting is a process rather than a one-off activity. And over time, through rethinking the job and what it means, job crafting has the potential to enable employees to imbue their work and themselves with greater meaning and significance. So you may be wondering more about the how-to, the nuts and bolts. And this can be admittedly a little bit of a black box without some hand-holding. If you're interested in a more systematic approach, there are a set of proprietary job crafting worksheets and exercises offered by researchers who originated or pioneered the term. And I included a link on this slide in case you want to consider purchasing it for yourself or for your organization. Okay, so personal strengths. This is the last type of person-focused intervention I'll highlight today. So this means asking people to identify and use their inherent or natural strengths instead of just focusing on weaknesses like we tend to do in the workplace, particularly for performance evaluations where we like to talk about what people lack. So the idea here is let's turn that on its head and talk about the strengths that people possess. And so this involves deliberately asking employees to identify their strengths and seek to identify specific ways of using them more so than they already do. There are 3 main strengths programs that I'm aware of and which have received a fair amount of research attention. So this means asking people to identify, the first is the values in action, or VIA classification, developed by Martin Seligman and colleagues, who are well-known researchers in the field of positive psychology. Second is the Clifton Strength Finder, which was developed by Gala. And third is the so-called reflected best possible self exercise, pioneered by a well-known group of management researchers. So first, the VIA classification of character strengths is a research-based survey that classifies and measures 24 individual differences that are grouped into one of 6 categories. So these categories, along the left side of the screen here, are wisdom, courage, humanity, justice, temperance, and transcendence. So let's define that. So cognitive strengths are labeled wisdom and include across the top in the lighter blue color, creativity, curiosity, judgment, love of learning, and perspective. Emotional strengths are labeled courage and include bravery, persistence, honesty, zest, and exercise of the will to accomplish goals even when faced with opposition. Interpersonal strengths are labeled humanity, and these are the capacity to be loved and to love, kindness, and social intelligence. Next, there's civic strengths, also called justice, which are attributes such as teamwork, fairness, and leadership. And these typically underlie healthy community life. Temperance are strengths protecting against excess and include forgiveness, modesty, prudence, and self-regulation. And then finally, strengths of transcendence are an appreciation of beauty and excellence, gratitude, hope, and religiousness. So the nice thing about the VIA is that you can take the survey online for free in about 15 minutes. You do need to register, but it's just providing them with your email address, and you can remove yourself from it after the fact if you don't want to be on the listserv. But I did include a direct link on the slide here if you want to check it out yourself. Like I said, it takes only 15 minutes, and you can get your customized report. Okay, so next, the Clifton Strengths Finder by Gallup is based on 34 themes of so-called talent, spanning 4 different areas across the top here. So those are executing, influencing, relationship building, and strategic thinking. So for example, people dominant in the executing theme on the left are know how to, quote, make things happen, and those strong in the achiever role in particular are said to have a great deal of stamina and take satisfaction from being busy and productive. In contrast, people strong in the relationship building themes have the ability to build strong relationships, and those strong in the empathy role in particular are said to have enhanced abilities to sense the feelings of other people. Unfortunately, the Gallup tool is proprietary, so there is a C, but if your organization has the resources, this can be both a useful and fun exercise. The last strengths-based tool I'll review is the Reflected Best Possible Self exercise. So this is a systematic feedback-seeking process for gathering and analyzing data about your best self, which means utilizing all of your greatest qualities and really thriving as a person. So the main task in this exercise is to collect feedback on a variety of people inside and outside work in order to gain insight on your unique strengths and talents. And the hope is that by gathering input from a variety of sources, you can really gain a much broader and richer sense of yourself than you could achieve from, say, just a standard performance evaluation. So those variety of sources include not only past and present colleagues, but also people like friends, mentors, family members, and so on. So this tool is proprietary, but I was able to find a Harvard Business Review article that outlines pretty closely the general steps that are involved in this process, and I included a link on the slide that I hope will be helpful. Okay, so there are many other individual practices beyond the 4 that I just covered, and unfortunately I don't have time to review these in great detail, but I did want to briefly list them here in case you're interested in learning more about these. So these other interventions include mindfulness, psychological capital, and goal setting. So in a nutshell, mindfulness involves noticing and observing emotional reactions, negative and positive as they are in the present, and without conferring any sort of judgment, in other words, acceptance of what is. This combination of present moment attention and non-judgmental acceptance may help people effectively respond to situations rather than reacting to them. Mindfulness has also proven to be very useful in the workplace, which for a lot of people can be a really emotionally challenging environment. There are lots of resources out there for practicing mindfulness online. I provided one link to some concrete practices and tools published by another center at UC Berkeley, which is the Greater Good Science Center, at the bottom of the page there. And lastly, goal setting. Second, psychological capital, or PsyCap, refers to a specific framework and training program designed by researchers. According to this framework, there are 4 proposed building blocks of so-called psychological capital: hope, efficacy, resilience, and optimism. So these terms, I'm sure, are starting to sound more familiar. Lastly, goal setting. So when you think of goal setting, you probably think of performance, and it can be used for that purpose, but here I'm talking about goal setting for impacting well-being. And if you think about it, goal setting could be used to impact well-being because it can help create a sense of control, competency, and a sense of empowerment when goals are achieved. The research suggests that ideally goals are SMART, meaning they are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. Okay, so now that I've reviewed the various positive workplace practices, I'd like to shift to a discussion of factors that may influence their effectiveness. So as I mentioned earlier, the science is still very much evolving, and not everyone responds to them in quite the same way, to the positive activities, that is. So we really need more information on the factors that determine why some people respond better to these practices than others. The logic is that if these can be identified, then practices could be designed to make them maximally beneficial for everyone. I've separated these factors into 3 broad categories. First, person factors. Second, activity factors. And third, organizational factors. So in discussing person and activity factors, I'd like to borrow from Leah Bemirsky's and colleagues' positive activity model, which aims to explain how and why performing positive activities makes people happier. So that's the bottom portion of your screen in blue here. According to this model, the positive activities I described today increase positive emotions, thoughts, behaviors, and need satisfaction, all of which in turn enhance well-being. The positive activity features and the end features of the person influence the degree to which these activities improve well-being. And something called optimal person-activity fit, so that's the overlap between the activity and the person, further predicts increases in well-being. So let me give you some examples. So 2 activity features are dosage and variety. So dosage is just like what you would imagine for a medication program where frequency and timing matter. Some research on positive psychology practices indicates that watering down positive activities by spreading them out might limit their potency. Mindfulness is a good example of this because it's one that you'd want to engage in regularly per the research to see the benefits as opposed to only doing it periodically. Other positive activities like kindness, however, might be easily overdone. Variety means different types of positive activities. So for example, research has shown that participants who performed a variety of kind acts every week increased their levels of well-being more than participants who perform the same kind of acts over and over again. 2 examples of person features are personality and effort. So starting with personality, this is a well-studied phenomenon and specifically refers to enduring or lasting individual differences that influence how people experience the world. So for example, research has found that participants with higher levels of extroversion and greater gains in well-being experience greater gains in well-being after completing positive activities, whereas people who have higher levels of emotional instability, which is another personality variable, do not benefit as greatly. So effort, this is an obvious one, but effort on the part of the person also predicts greater increases in well-being in response to positive activities. So effort includes continued adherence to activities and also the continuation of activities after the formal program evaluation period has ended. So this isn't necessarily an idea that's supported by research, but just as an example, someone who does one gratitude practice daily for a week daily for a week may reap more benefits compared to someone who does the exercise just once that week. And lastly, as I mentioned, person-activity fit plays a role in determining effectiveness. So supporting this idea, person-activity fit, participants with a strong preference for well-being activity to which they are assigned in field studies tend to experience greater gains in their well-being. Likewise, people who see tasks as natural and enjoyable also tend to reap the most benefits. A good example I like to provide is some people have this enduring attitude that they can't calm their mind. And it's these sorts of expectations that can make things like mindfulness a challenging choice for these individuals. Okay, next, organizational factors. So this is another big category that I really am just glossing over due to lack of time, but this is any factor that goes beyond the person or the activity or the interaction between the two. And two major factors are supportive leadership practices and organizational climate and culture. So these two really are closely related because leadership practices and style often have a profound downstream impact on climate and culture. So in terms of supportive leadership, this means that leadership must not only condone and accept, but also encourage and support positive practices in organizations. A single person championing these efforts won't cut it, and you really need support from the top. And related, a supportive climate and culture is one that emphasizes health and well-being, is focused on personal development and growth of employees, as opposed to just output, and it's one that is purpose, as opposed to simply performance-driven. Okay, so in this final section of the webinar, I'll review 5 specific guidelines for practice that I have developed based on my knowledge of the research and also my practical experience. My first recommendation is to facilitate choice. So as I just explained, positive psychology practices don't affect everyone in the same way or to the same degree. Some people may even have a negative response to certain activities, like mindfulness. This means it's important to let people choose the activity or set of activities based on their personal needs and preferences. So one way to do this is, much like a candy shop, offer an assortment of activity options and let people choose their flavor. There's a fine line between encouragement and coercion. I recently discovered this when attempting to implement a positive psychology program in a large organization where employees were not very interested in participating in the program. My colleagues and I noticed this resistance from the get-go and communicated this to management, but management was pretty insistent that they thought this would be good for the employees. And we tried to implement it, but ultimately this approach backfired because employees did not sign up to participate, and ultimately we had to cancel the program. So the moral of the story is, don't fall victim to voluntelling people because you think it will be good for them. People really need to be bought in, ready to participate, and not feel any sort of pressure to do so. So also, as I mentioned, many of these activities are straightforward and self-directed. But at the same time, employees who opt in need to be given the proper structure and support. These supports include informational and instructional resources, such as activity completion guidelines as needed. Some of the activities I mentioned, like the best self exercise, require a fair amount of hand-holding because it really won't be a familiar exercise for folks. Supportive technology may also be needed for some of these exercises. So, for example, people need access to the online survey to complete the Gallup and VIA Strength Survey and to receive their customized report of their strengths. Paid user access may also be needed for more structured support of some activities like the Gallup Strength Finder and the proprietary job crafting exercise. Third, supervisor support is also critical. People need not only time from work to engage in the activities, but also encouragement, buy-in, and involvement. I think the last two are really important for job crafting in particular, which means making alterations to your job responsibilities, as I just covered. This activity, as I'm sure you can imagine, can affect other people you work with. And so it's important to have open conversations with your supervisor to identify and negotiate different opportunities. Third, measure program effectiveness for its impact on positive outcomes. Some examples of which are listed here. In other words, is what you're implementing working to measurably increase positive outcomes? Here's a basic design that can be used to measure program effectiveness. It's one that I've used in field studies. And here you can see that employees are randomized into either an intervention group that engages in the positive activities for a month, or into a waitlist control group that holds off on engaging in the activities until a month later, after the first group. So if you're not familiar with research design, generally speaking, a control group is included so that you can isolate the impact of the program on outcomes and rule out any alternative explanations of the results. A waitlist control, as opposed to a pure control, the one that never completes the program, is preferred because you don't want to deny people the opportunity to participate in something that could benefit them. I suggest taking assessments at several time points, so ideally at baseline or before the program gets started, and then immediately following it, and also 1 month later or at some time later to assess any potential follow-up effects, because you might not see effects immediately, but these may turn up in time. So in terms of measuring effectiveness, there also are several key considerations to keep in mind, but please recognize that this is the absolute ideal. I recognize that in practice, these considerations are not always possible. So first, it can be helpful to test out a program with a subset of employees before launching it more widely in an organization. This way you can identify and preempt any unanticipated obstacles and feasibility issues. Also, as I already mentioned, follow-up surveys can be used to assess the long-term impact of a program. It's also important to match whatever outcomes you measure to the specific activity type. So for example, job crafting might yield higher work-related meaning, and gratitude practices may have more of an impact on work-related emotion. The two are different. And lastly, I want to add a huge caveat to all this, which is that it may be useful to employ a social science consultant to assist with appropriately measuring effectiveness. I really wouldn't recommend doing this without guidance from a trained advisor, unless you already do have training or experience doing so. If resources are limited, you might consider reaching out to a pro bono practitioner or a researcher from a local university who might be willing to advise. On this slide, I also included a link to the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology's consultant locator, which can be a useful resource for finding folks knowledgeable in program evaluation. And some people may even be willing to do so for free or in exchange for data. 4, solicit participant feedback. So in addition to measuring effectiveness, so measuring the impact on those outcomes that I mentioned, I also recommend soliciting open-ended feedback from program participants. And this is recommended when evaluating and further developing any sort of employee program. These questions can be added to an effectiveness survey or asked as part of an employee focus group or one-on-one interviews for hard-to-reach populations. If you have a large organization and a lot of participants, a survey is probably most resource efficient, but focus group discussions can be a really rich source of information that surveys don't readily provide. So here are some examples of questions that I might ask in a program evaluation focus group. Typically, these are short, open-ended, and ask only one question at a time. So as you can see, questions of this nature can be a rich source of information about employees' experience in the program and lead you to think about aspects of the program's value and feasibility that you may not have considered. So these questions include things like, how did you learn about the program? What motivated you to participate? Did you enjoy participating? Why or why not? How did your participation impact you personally? Did anything prevent your full participation? What changes would you recommend making to the program? And I also always suggest an open-ended question or essay box where people can just say whatever it is that they want to say that's on their mind that you may not have thought to ask about. Also, another thing to mention here is that there are some well-known best practices for focus groups from social science research, which would also apply here. And I don't have time to cover these best practices today in detail, but In case helpful on this slide, I included a link to a resource on best practices from the Society for Human Resource Management, or SHRM, where you can learn more if you're interested. Last but not least, my fifth recommendation is to address well-being systemically. I made this point at the beginning of the talk, but the key here is that organizational level policies also matter in addition to the individual level ones that I focused on in this presentation. So put simply, if you're interested in cultivating employee well-being, positive psychology practices can't be the only thing employees are offered. That's because well-being is a function of a variety of factors, including supportive management, some degree of decision latitude, like job control or autonomy. So this is the amount of discretion that employees have to determine where they work, when they work, and how they do it. Having fair pay, social support, and manageable workload. Having quality health insurance and safe working conditions. Also that developmental opportunities like access to learning programs and mentorship. And as you can see, positive psychology practices are just one piece of the pie. The organization really has a substantial responsibility to meet employees' needs in these other more systemic ways as well. So I therefore tend to view positive practices as a complement to other more systemic changes. I made several key points throughout today's webinar. First, employees and organizations have a wide range of positive psychology exercises to choose from in the workplace based on their needs, preferences, and readiness. These include gratitude, kind acts, job crafting, and personal strength. It's important to remember that positive psychology practices are not one size fits all, and that there are several factors, person, activity, and organizational, that influence their effectiveness. I hope I've also conveyed how guidance from the research and best practices can help shape the effective implementation of positive psychology practices in organizations. And the specific recommendations that I made are to facilitate choice, to provide appropriate structure and support, to measure effectiveness, to solicit participant feedback, and to address well-being systemically. And I also included a slide, if it will pop up, oh, there we go, with some resources from other positive organizational psychology organizations that study this and practice this. And so you can see here that there's a link to the Greater Good Science Center at the University of California, Berkeley, also the Center for Positive Organizations at the University of Michigan, and the Positive Psychology Center at the University of Pennsylvania. All of these have rich websites with a lot of reading material, tools, and other things that can help get you started and farther along in your journey. So thank you very much for your attention. It was my pleasure to present this material, and I hope that you found at least something useful. And I believe at this point we'll shift into the Q&A portion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was a very descriptive and very interesting webinar. I learned a lot of things today. Thank you, Dr. Winslow. So I have a couple of questions for you. So the first one was if there's any follow-up with the implementation of gratitude activities in the workplace, if there's any indicators of how successful they are.
Any indicators of success?
Yes.
Yeah, so let me go back a couple slides here. So I would suggest, if you're able to measure effectiveness in the way that's recommended here on this slide on measuring effectiveness, this is where the follow-up surveys come into play. So you not only want to assess changes immediately after somebody's been engaging in the program, but also later down the line. So maybe in my own research, I've done 1 month later and also 2 months later to see if these sorts of activities have more downstream effects. And it may also be the case that the effect on gratitude is immediate. So you might see that people experience an increase in gratitude immediately following completion of the activity, but that impacts on some of the other outcomes that might be relevant, like job satisfaction, which typically take longer to develop, might occur later in time. So I guess the short answer to the question is that these can be addressed through follow-up surveys.
Okay, thank you. The other question is related to the strengths approach. And this person is asking if it makes sense to focus more on employees' strengths instead of doing performance reviews, or if they should be used simultaneously, and if actually there's a caveat for following only on the strengths, because then that may result in employees not be able to overcome their weaknesses, as they would not address those.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I definitely don't mean to suggest replacing a strength approach with the traditional approach. I think there is a way to merge the two, such that both opportunities for development as well as strengths are highlighted. The idea here, or the kind of the rationale for the strengths-based approach, is that in the workplace, performance evaluation does typically only tend to focus on what people are so-called lacking. And I think, it could go a long way in terms of encouraging employees and also helping them have a sense of self-efficacy about their ability to do their job and do it well, if managers can also be frank with employees about what they do well. And I think it can be challenging in today's work environment where, there's a focus on output and getting things done, but stopping to do that can really make such a great difference, is what the research suggests. So I do think that both are important, and there is kind of like an art, if you will, like I was saying earlier, to combining the two into a single approach. Mm-hmm. So I would very much advocate for doing both simultaneously to the extent possible. I don't think that they're necessarily mutually exclusive. Yeah,
it makes total sense. There's a question about choice. You said that participants in this type of exercises should have some choice on what are the exercises that they do. But two people were wondering how much choice is optimal. Because some may be okay, but too many choices can be overwhelming. And
that's another good question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, and there was something like about how can the employer help direct employees on narrowing down those choices?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. I think there needs to be more research on this. And I think researchers have started to look into it, but basically what I mean is a systematic evaluation of what's the ideal number of options to give people before they start feeling overwhelmed, or, before they start feeling like they don't have enough to work with. Kind of to draw an analogy, there's been research on focus groups and the ideal number of people who should be in a focus group in order to derive benefits. And I think the same can sort of be said here. I don't know the answer to that question off the top of my head, but I imagine maybe the important thing, just speaking off the cuff, would be to offer at least a handful of like maybe 4 or 5 activities that focus on different aspects of well-being. Mm-hmm. So earlier in the presentation, like I talked about the distinction between positive emotions and efficacy and meaning. So that all represents well-being, but very different aspects of it. And so, to the extent that activities can tap into those different aspects, I think there's value in that, as opposed to having all, as we say, like hedonically focused activities that all focus on stimulating positive emotions. So actually, the 4 that I offered in this this presentation, that's part of the reason I chose them, because I do think they focus on different aspects of well-being and could be a pretty neat combination if you wanted to launch your own program.
Yeah, and also what I was thinking was that, for example, when offering the choices, the outcomes that may be related to each choice can be made explicit to the employee. The employees go like, well, actually, what I need in my job is a little bit more meaning. So then they will go into job crafting, or well, yes, I think that I need just to enhance my positive emotions and my engagement and my excitement about my job. So maybe my gratitude, for example.
Yeah, it sounds like a little bit of like coaching.
Yes.
To kind of guide people into what makes sense for them, give a little more background on the activity and the intended effect. I think that could be all really helpful if the organization has the resources for it.
Yeah. Okay, and then the last question. Let's go to the measuring effectiveness slide, the key considerations. So this person is asking, like, well, it looks like this is the ideal. But is there a bare minimum that you would recommend? For example, is there not enough resources to do the full list of measuring effectiveness? So how would you go about it, like a minimum?
Okay. Yeah, it certainly isn't ideal. I would say, so of the three on the slide here, the pilot test, the follow-up surveys, and the match between practices and outcomes, probably the match between practices and outcomes is more of a priority. And I say this, it depends on why you're doing this, but assuming that you're interested in making a business case for these practices, you want to be able to demonstrate that they had an impact. And I think an important part of that is matching the gratitude activity, for example, to the outcome that it's intended to impact. So maybe, like as you just said, job crafting you'd be more likely to see an effect based on the research on purpose and meaning, as opposed to something like job crafting. So it would be kind of a waste of resources, I would suggest, if the survey that you're designing doesn't quite match up, because it's like a missed opportunity. So you really want to be careful and judicious about that if you're interested in seeing the changes.
Yeah, I totally agree. It makes total sense. So yeah, I guess that's the key issue, is to match the practice with what you need to improve in the organization and what you're going to measure. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Perfect. So, well, we don't have more questions. Again, thank you so much for the webinar. It was eye-opening, and I hope it's very useful for our audience.
Me too, and please feel free to contact me, participants, with any questions or comments or feedback that you might have. I'm really glad that you could join us. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Caroline, for this compelling webinar, and that demonstrates the importance of flexibility and choice related to the implementation of positive psychology practices, and that employees and organizations have numerous positive psychology exercises to select from in the workplace based on their needs and preferences. Thank you. And thank you, Gloria, for playing such a key role in the Psychology in the Workplace webinar series. It is a true pleasure to have you both online today. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us.